Good
Good
afternoon.
yes.
Good afternoon, honourable members, Secretary to Parliament, invited panellists, representatives of civil society organisations, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for joining us in this third instalment of our Just Transition webinar series. My name is Leon Gabriel. I'm the Division Manager, Knowledge and Information Services at our National Parliament. This seminar program, led by the Parliamentary Research Unit, forms part of Parliament's knowledge management and capacity building program. This afternoon's session will explore the global climate change emergency from a country perspective in the run-up to COP27 in Egypt next month, and is co-hosted in collaboration with Honourable Frolick, House Chairperson in the National Assembly. Before I hand over to the Secretary to Parliament to officially open today's discussions, I'd like to highlight a few matters to ensure active participation and smooth running of our webinar today. Firstly, we do have quite a tightly packed program, so presenters are requested to please be mindful of their respective time allocation. Cameras of presenters are to please be switched on when presenting, and we kindly ask presenters to also drop their presentations in the chat box. Microphones have been disabled apart from the presenters, and participation is encouraged through the Q&A functionality. Participants will, however, also have an opportunity to pose questions to presenters orally during the discussion slot towards the end of the program. I ask that we please keep written and oral questions brief and specific in order to facilitate maximum participation in the available time. And we also ask that you please participate in our short opinion poll once it's up and running during the course of the webinar. The results of which we will present towards the end of the program, and this will assist in our forward planning. I'm certain that we will all enjoy the presentations and discussions this afternoon and learn a great deal in the process. With those few words, I now invite the Secretary to Parliament, Mr. George, to do the official opening, and welcome. Over to you, Secretary. Secretary, I'm not sure if you could hear me. If you could go ahead, sir, your microphone is unmuted. And if you could also switch on your camera.
Thank you very much, Program Director, and greetings to you and greetings to all the honorable members who are present here, to the Honorable Chairperson Frolick, as well as all the invited and esteemed guests who are present here, all protocol observed. Let me extend my warm greetings to all of you and express our appreciation for this timely roundtable that focuses on South Africa's preparation for the 27th Conference of Parties. The theme of this roundtable fits well with the description of our times, the times we live in, the times of climate change emergency. As a result, it is important for us as Parliament to play a central role in supporting the country's response to this climate emergency. As a country, we are still reeling from the aftermath of the devastating floods in KZN that caused enormous distress to people and also caused severe destruction of infrastructure in this beautiful province of ours. Likewise, provinces like Eastern Cape and Northwest suffered the same fate. It's quite clear that as a country, we need to recognize that simple rebuilding infrastructure without addressing climate change resilience means that our communities will remain vulnerable to calamities such as the one we have just witnessed last year. These floods, no doubt, and many other climate-induced disasters like drought, heat waves, etc., have proven that South Africa's disaster management is not geared towards mitigative measures to avoid huge losses of life and damage to infrastructure upon receiving warnings about these disasters. As a result, as South Africa prepares for COP27, it is crucial that we advocate for credible action to address recent escalating climate impacts and progress, to offer loss and damage support for the most vulnerable in our society. On the other hand, we believe that South Africa is well equipped to institutionalize climate change response and environmental management policies and programs at a national level under the stewardship of the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment. There are various policies on adaptation and mitigation that we have as a country, and we are well on our way to develop a climate change legislation to mobilize the whole of society towards climate action. Chairperson and honorable members, the low carbon resilient society and just transition requires a structural change of enormous scale and speed. It requires joint action by all sectors of society and all levels of government. As a result, coordinating these efforts and ensuring their coherence within a multi-level governance system is key to driving forward effective, efficient, and ambitious climate actions. As a global climate change negotiation shifts from building consensus and planning towards bold implementation, of which COP27's theme clearly states, together for implementation, it is quite clear, Program Director, that we need more ambitious nationally determined contributions with matching climate finance for both mitigation and adaptation. In our country, there's been a groundswell of local action that has been recognized as driving forward transformation. Government can leverage on this local action through improved multi-level governance. And central to that is our role as Parliament to coordinate these ambitious climate targets across government departments and engaging provincial and local government as key implementers and decision makers that will go a long way to unlock potential and drive transformative just transition. Roles and responsibilities, of course, differ from level to level of government, but achieving the goals of the Paris Agreement requires that international, national, provincial, and local actors seek to complement each other's action and collaborate for a climate resilient, low emission future. Honorable Chairperson and Program Director, the department's efforts in rallying the whole country to respond to climate change through the passing of climate change bill will no doubt go a long way, that we will be able to assist to facilitate that as Parliament, and we note and support it. Parliament also welcomes the work of the Presidential Climate Commission to lead South Africa's just transition journey to respond to climate change. A priority should be to change the mindset of sector departments, local government, private sector, and the whole of society to identify opportunities associated with the performance of their functions and mandates that will contribute to climate change response. Therefore, Program Director, the major focus of our work should be to guide the whole of the country on how there can be a good response on climate change, also to monitor the extent to which this change is happening in all sectors of society. Thirdly, to advocate for financial and technical support nationally, internationally, to implement climate action, the just transition, and cover the cost of loss and damage. Chairperson, as South African Parliament, we are committed to mobilizing the whole of government and society to step up and contribute towards a global ambition for climate resilience, putting people and nature first in pursuit of a resilient world where we do not just survive climate shocks and stresses, but thrive in spite of them. I thank you.
Thank you, Secretary, for that general and insightful overview. It gives me great pleasure to move directly now on to Mr. Crispin Olver, who is the Executive Director, Presidential Climate Commission. Mr. Olver will speak to us about contextualizing climate change emergency in South Africa. Mr. Olver, over to you.
Thank you, Program Director, and a very good afternoon, Honourable Members of Parliament, the Honourable Chairperson Frolick, the Secretary to Parliament, Mr. George, to my commissioners. There are a number of my commissioners who are joining us and listening in this afternoon, and of course to all the other stakeholders and panelists. It's a great pleasure to be with you. I've prepared a short presentation, which I'd like to give, if I may. What I'd like to focus on is the just transition in the context of this climate emergency that you referred to. And as I'm sure most of you are, sorry, that's the slide. As most of you are aware, South Africa's very recently adopted the Just Transition Framework, and it's an extremely important document because it seeks to achieve an equitable distribution of risks and responsibilities in the context of the historical liability that exists for the climate catastrophe. And when I talk about an equitable distribution of risks, I mean both within the borders of our country. So we want to ensure that it's not the most vulnerable, the poor, workers, communities that bear all the costs of this climate transition. And equally, there's an international dimension because, the bulk of the carbon in the atmosphere comes from the long period of industrial development of developed countries in the north, and they ultimately bear the primary liability for redress and the loss and damage that's caused by climate change. So, very importantly, when we talk about a just transition, I mean, a lot of our discussions is focused on nationally and how we address the needs of the vulnerable in our country, but we must never lose sight of this, major global inequity that exists between developed and developing worlds. Integral to this idea of a just transition is also an inclusive approach. And we don't just talk about inclusion because it's a nice to have. What we want to make sure of is that those that are most affected by this transition, that are most, have the most at stake, the most to lose, are directly involved in decisions about how we address this emergency, how fast we cut our emissions, how we build adaptive capacity, how we mobilize the resources. And, businesses and the middle class in our country are going to be able to basically move, adapt. They've got the resources to respond to many of these emergencies. What we've got to be doing is providing active support to workers and communities, both where there are mitigation-induced economic shifts and where there are physical impacts. And more broadly, given the historical dispossession, inequity, and inequality that exists, we want to use the opportunities in this transition to structurally change the economy, to change the ownership patterns in our economy, and to put assets and resources in the hands of previously disadvantaged people. What I want to show you is a sort of a rough sketch of the emissions trajectory. I'm sure you've heard about net zero. What the science tells us, this is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, they've made it abundantly clear that to avoid the worst effects of climate, by the middle of the century, that's by 2050, we need to get the global economy to an aggregate net zero position, where the residual emissions that we still are emitting are offset by, carbon capture in terms of sinks and carbon capture and storage and other methods. Getting to net zero, so some countries will get there earlier. The developed world needs to lead the way, so we're expecting them to get there in the 2040s. Developing countries will follow. They'll transition a little bit later. But what's become very clear to us in South Africa is that we don't want to delay our transition, because we have a very emissions-intensive economy, which is vulnerable to trade risks. So as the world starts to transition, we don't want to be shut out of global markets, and we don't want to lose on the early stage technological development and investment that we need. So we've accepted that we need to transition. Government has signed off on an emissions trajectory that's set out in what we call our nationally determined contribution. And I'm presenting to you here a sort of broad sketch of that transition. So these are the emissions and how they'll reduce towards 2050. And you can see the division between power sector, energy industries, transport, industrial processes, waste, and other sectors. And in the next 10 years, the biggest cuts are going to come in the power sector. It's also the place where we can make the cheapest and quickest reductions in emissions. And that's principally through the energy efficiency. So we need to ramp up our energy efficiency programs, ramp up our investment in renewables, which we've started as a country, and balance the grid with investments in upgrading the grid, in storage capacity, and in peaking capacity to balance the grid when the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow. So this all implies major changes in our economy, major structural changes. And what we're particularly worried about from a just transition perspective is the impact that it has on jobs and livelihoods. And there's some really excellent studies that have been done that have looked at employment implications of this transition. And the good news is that in aggregate, as we do this radical adjustment to our economy, we are going to create more jobs than we're going to lose. We are going to lose some jobs. You can see on the left in red the direct and indirect job losses that are going to be triggered by the transition. And above that, the operations and maintenance and constructions and investment jobs that will be created. And, fortunately, there's a positive balance. And there are going to be big shifts within particular sectors. So, the sectors that are going to lose jobs are the ones that are most exposed to the fossil fuel economy. So coal and petroleum are, obvious candidates. Basic chemicals, other chemicals, they're going to be particularly badly affected. But, at the same time, we've got a number of sectors that are going to grow dramatically. So we're going to do fantastically well in PGMs and all of the mining and ancillary metal ores linked to not just PGMs, but all of the minerals for the future green economy, the cobalt, the nickel, the lithium, the vanadium. Also iron and steel is going to continue to do well, copper, manganese. We're also going to have huge job increases around the production of green hydrogen. And its transportation through pipelines, export processing. There's going to be some jobs linked to fuel cells. We're going to make jobs in electrolyzers, and we're going to obviously make jobs linked to renewable energy and the energy rollout that's going to happen. So, you know, as you can see, big structural shifts in employment. And they're also going to be big regional shifts. And, you know, this is just a map of all the mineral resources in the country. And you can see in that red circle, I mean, clearly the big worry is in Mpumalanga. I mean, that's where all of our coal resources are, in Mpumalanga, parts of Limpopo, parts of northern KZN. And that's where the greatest impact is going to be felt, and where the greatest concentration of effort has to be if we want to manage the transition. So as the Climate Commission, we went around the country, we conducted a number of community consultations to hear what communities were saying about this transition and how they felt by it, and including a number of consultations in Mpumalanga. And, you know, we heard people are ambivalent. You know, on the one hand, they are facing very severe air pollution, pollution of the water catchments. You know, the coal mining communities are suffering as a consequence of the activities of coal mining, the trucking in Carolina. I mean, there's a lot of social degradation linked to it. So, you know, they understand that this current economy really affects their health and their livelihoods and their environment. But they're ambivalent about the transition because people don't want to leave jobs that they have in existing coal mines and power stations for the promise of jobs in sectors that they can't yet see. So communities want to see hard, you know, concrete deliverables that they can have confidence in. So that's what this just transition framework sets out to do. And you will have seen that it has a number of components. I mean, first of all, a big focus on industrial policy. So how do we build out our renewable energy and battery manufacturing industry? How do we put the infrastructure and the incentives in place to support the move to electric vehicles, green hydrogen and minerals? How do we use public procurement to accelerate change? And how do we support small businesses and localization? Then there's a number of active labor market interventions we've spoken about, particularly teeing up the skills pipeline so that we're equipping the labor force for the future. You know, what does the labor force look like in the 2030s and 40s? And how do we align the whole, you know, production system, basic education, higher education, skill development, reskilling, upskilling, and link that also to job placement and employment incentives. And then lastly, we have to talk about the social support mechanisms. I mean, it's essential that people have the basic accesses to services, healthcare, and human settlements. We've got to actively build community resilience and livelihoods. And for workers that we cannot place in jobs, we've got to essentially guarantee them income support and early retirement provisions for some workers. We've also set out a range of governance measures that are integral to delivering on the just transition. These are inclusion. I've already talked about the importance of involving stakeholders and affected communities. Integration, because, you know, what I've been talking about affects a whole range of different line departments and agencies across government and different levels, you know, national, provincial, local government. And it's important that we have a coordinated approach within government to delivering this, and that we modernize our energy governance system as part of it. There's also, very importantly, corporate responsibility. So the corporates have a big job to deliver on their ESG commitments, for the mining companies to implement their social and labor plans, make sure that they've got their rehabilitation funds adequately capitalized, and when the mines reach the end of the life, actively rehabilitate that land and redistribute it back to communities. And then, you know, very importantly, we've got to look at dedicated regional development mechanisms. for instance, in Mpumalanga. And lastly, accountability. And, just to give you an example, Mpumalanga is obviously the cutting edge. It's the immediate focus area. And there's already a lot of stuff happening there. The problem is it's a little bit uncoordinated, and we need to start strengthening the way that these different initiatives are pulled together. So, for instance, Mpumalanga has set up this Green Cluster Agency. It's already started work, and it's doing some fantastic things. There's a Just Transition Unit being set up in the DG's office to coordinate work. You will have seen that yesterday Cabinet approved this Jetp investment plan. There are a number of mechanisms in that plan for supporting economic diversification and skills development, particularly in Mpumalanga. There's the decommissioning of Komati underway. There's work that's being done by the private sector through this initiative called Impact Catalyst that's very exciting. Sasol is doing some major investments now in their Secunda plant around green hydrogen production. And then there are other programs, GIZ supporting some work with TIPS and Green Cape, and there's a whole program of mobilizing local government around the just transition. We also need to talk about how we mobilize the funding for this. I mean, I referred to the $8.5 billion deal that's just been announced. In fact, if we look at the full costs of this transition, so all the mitigation and adaptation and just transition elements, we're talking about big numbers, particularly if we project them out to 2050. So we think we're going to spend just north of 8 trillion rands on the transition to 2050. That's a really big number. The bulk of it is going to come from South Africa's very deep and quite mobile capital markets, so domestic savings. And we need to talk about how to mobilize that investment, how to de-risk it, how to promote disclosure through this new climate finance taxonomy. Obviously, public funding is very important for this transition. So there's work underway to integrate the just transition into the fiscal framework and to set up a dedicated just transition financing mechanism. And then very importantly, the developed countries in the North have to step up and do their share of the responsibility. And, just to be clear, the 8.5 billion is not nearly their share in terms of financing this transition. Their liability extends way beyond that. And then there's, importantly also, I mean, it's a much smaller scale, but philanthropic capital also has a role to play, particularly in what I would call the soft infrastructure around institutional capacity, skills development, bottom-up processes, etc. I'm going to end with my last slide on the role of Parliament. And I have to say, Parliament's got a fundamentally important role in this transition. And just some reflections on that role. Firstly, around accountability. And I think Parliament can make a huge difference through championing this idea of a just transition and holding government and its social partners to account for the various things that they're meant to be doing around the just transition. Secondly, I mentioned the importance of integration. So, just transition cuts across a whole range of different social and economic functions. It's by no longer just an environmental issue. It really is a core development and economic issue for this country. And I really applaud the way that Parliament has now set up this integrated working group on climate change. I think it recognizes this integrated approach that's needed. But equally, you've got a role to play in demanding that government across all these different agencies is accountable and works in an integrated way. Then in terms of the legislation, I mean, you're currently passing the climate bill. I know Parliament's also considering some very important other pieces of legislation, such as the Electricity Regulation Amendment Bill. These are all key pieces of the legislative framework that will ensure a just transition. And then, I mentioned the role of provincial and local government, and through the NCOP, I think there's a really important role to play in helping provincial and local government take up the just transition in their own planning and be accountable for it. So thank you, Chair. I'm going to leave it at that. It's short and sweet. I want to thank you for the opportunity to present. It's a real honor. And I've put my contact details there if you want to get hold of us. Also, please visit our website. And if you want to sign up for our newsletter, we put out a newsletter every week or so, keeping people abreast of any of the work that we do. Thank you very much. It's great to have had this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Mr. Olver, for highlighting not only our global obligations, but also our obligations to communities in South Africa in this context of a just transition. And of course, reminding us of, or informing us of some of the key implications and outcomes of the transition process in South Africa. And of course, some insights on the role of Parliament. You touched a little bit on financing, and indeed, we will move now onto the complex and somewhat contentious issue of financing climate emergency. And we are very privileged to have Mr. Daniel Menele, who is the head of the Presidential Climate Finance Task Team. Over to you, Mr. Menele. Mr. Menele, your microphone is still muted, sir. You could unmute.
Yeah, that should make things a lot easier. Apologies for that. Good afternoon, and may I also humbly be requested to have observed all protocols. Thanks for the invitation to participate in this roundtable and this very important dialogue. I think the Secretary of Parliament and the comments we've just heard now from Crispin over his presentation have actually set the scene quite nicely for my intervention, which essentially is about the criticality of the need for finance and other forms of support to address the South Africa's climate emergency. And of course, the nature of the challenge that we're up against requires us to mobilize at scale resources to address the climate risks, of course, both domestic resources, which Crispin was talking to earlier around us having a deep and liquid capital markets, but that is insufficient. That needs to be augmented by international funding to get us to having a chance of meeting these really vast requirements in terms of financial resources. And we know from the climate agreement from Paris that the finance flows are all meant to contribute towards a pathway to low emissions and climate resilient development, has been said, but also this is in line with developed countries' commitment to support developing countries in the transitions. We go to the next slide, please. As requested, I'll share with you today just one of the avenues that South Africa has followed in financing the climate emergency, namely how the Presidential Climate Finance Task Team has gone about its task in engaging around the financing of a just energy transition in South Africa and its broader contribution as part of its broader contribution to the climate response. And I am pleased to inform you that we presented just yesterday our most recent draft of the investment plan to Cabinet and got the requisite endorsement, and more details will soon follow, which will be made publicly available as part of soliciting input as we move into the more critical stage of implementation. So what I'll talk to this afternoon is just around some of the challenges around financing, a very complex undertaking, and then the financing principles that we have developed to guide us in this work, and then talk specifically to the Just Energy Transition Partnership as the model that we are working on at the moment, and then go to talk to you a little about how we went about putting together this investment plan and about funding channels, and then close off by just indicating what the contribution to South Africa's climate response the JET will deliver. Go to the next slide, please, if I may ask. I won't dwell too much on this because this is very much contextual and quite a number of issues the two previous speakers have touched upon. Only to say that the context of the climate change response that we need to mount is one of South Africa having to grapple with inequality, unemployment, having to deal with us having huge economic exposure, intersectoral, that needs to be well managed, a process, and as we create new industry to transition to, and to responsibly exit others. This is happening in an environment where our economy as such is already challenged. Growth rates have been rather low in the last decade, exacerbated by our need to respond to COVID and the damage done that way. And of course, the exposure that we've got to these risks has been said, but also the fact that we are very, very highly dependent on fossil fuels, and that such a transition will not be easy, especially if we transition out of a situation where we already have an energy supply crisis. We go to the next slide. As I indicated, in thinking about the financing of the investment plan, we needed to be clear around certain principles that would guide us in the engagement with our partners. So, and critical to that was that we had a country-led and a country-owned a process that would ensure that we don't just take care of the quantity as regards the finance that's required, but also the quality, such that it meets the South Africa's needs, unique as they present themselves under the circumstances that we operate. And of course, as a middle-income country, below investment grades with huge demands on our fiscal for development and social security needs broadly, and needs for social protection, safety nets, and so forth. This becomes a real challenge, and we need to be very focused around those principles so that you do indeed are able to mobilize finance in a manner that speaks to the country's ambition and its priorities. So the set of financing principles and our preferred terms and conditions influenced how, as the task team, we approach the financing challenge. And you can see on the slide there, just to run through some of them there, I mean, very critical was that the finance needed to follow the UN FCCC principles, which stipulate support to developing countries from developed countries, as I indicated earlier, as they advance their climate responses. Second, very critical one, although not easy to achieve, but ideally, this finance should be additional to existing climate and development commitment, and not result in a situation where they're being diverted from other critical development assistance priorities to the climate situation. Yeah, the lines can be blurred there, but as I say, ideally one strives to have this support being over and above existing commitments. I indicated that one key principle is that the composition of the financing and the instruments should ensure that they reflect South Africa's unique needs as reflected in our investment plan, and that we take account of our fiscal realities from a point of view of sustainability and affordability, and that in the process there is an incorporation of appropriate risk-sharing arrangements. Key and central to our just transition, as Crispin has just said, is obviously the just component. And so we must make sure that as we mobilize financing, that this just component basically pervades the various financing structures and is mainstreamed into the design of the projects and then the financing programs for them. And another critical one is around being able to ensure that we get attractive terms for any debt-related financing, and that meaning that we should be able to borrow at more attractive terms than South Africa's National Treasury would ordinarily be able to secure in the capital markets, and that's where the issues of high levels of concessionality comes into play as well. And to be able to sustain a clear and structured investment path, we also need to be able to know that the finance flows from our partner countries will be predictable and will be certain, and to allow a proper planning for investment. And then we also need to make sure that the modalities of accessing these funds in terms of how they're channeled into the South African economy should be such that we take advantage of the capacity and the capability that resides with domestic institutions, development finance institutions such as the IDC and the DBSA, who are well placed, given the experience of their government structures, to facilitate this flow in a cost-efficient manner. And of course, we need to partner with the private sector and make sure that in the process, the risks are appropriately allocated and shared. And last but certainly not least, we need to make sure that the entire process is governed properly in terms of safeguards that need to be put in place to manage various governance risks that may arise from processes such as this one. Get to the next one. Here we give you just a feel for the model that we chose in terms of how we would work with the group of these international partner countries, which we refer to as the IPG, in giving effect to the Just Energy Transition Partnership to mobilize around of these needs that we've articulated over a period of 3 to 5 years, as agreed in the political declaration that gave rise to the partnership. And as you can see there, we have essentially on the South African side a structure that consists of a number of tiers. At the top of it, of course, the South African government, which is the ultimate owner of the investment plan. The Presidential Climate Finance Task Team, which I lead, was established to liaise with this group through an interministerial committee which oversees the process and then into cabinet. And our counterpart, our main counterpart, is this international partners group consisting of these 5 jurisdictions: France, Germany, the UK, the US, and the EU. And we have jointly established a secretariat, which is an independent team of technical experts that coordinate expert roundtables, working group, and most importantly, were very instrumental in helping us develop the investment plan that I spoke to earlier on. The objectives of the Jetp were articulated at the outset in the political declaration that was signed at Glasgow last year, and very briefly relate to supporting South Africa in accelerated decarbonization of our electricity system, to support our efforts around a just transition that protects vulnerable workers and communities. Part of it was also to see how we manage, or we are supported in managing as a country Eskom's debt, and how we define the role of the private sector, and how we create an enabling environment to allow us to resolve these various challenges, and how we look at new opportunities for local value chains that would include SMMEs and opportunities for innovation and private investments as part of a job creation drive of new, green, high quality jobs. The next slide just shows the cumulative process of how we've responded, and essentially demonstrates the integrated and structured nature of our approach to the response. And as you can see, it starts off with the National Development Plan, which already had a focus around tackling systemic challenges around poverty, inequality, and unemployment. And then the next step in that vein being the NDC that Crispin spoke to. And it's that ambitious NDC, that South African ambition, which caught, I think, the attention of our partners to say, look, these people we can work with. And it's on that basis that the development of the declaration came about, the political declaration to establish the Jetp. Then we had the Just Transition Framework to guide the overall overarching long-term response, as Crispin has said, and which then now culminated into the investment plan, which is addressing the initial period, if you wish, just to kickstart our journey of transition. But essentially, this shows you how the response is integrated. And the next slide gives a sense, just an outline of the activities during the period of developing the plan, and how we thought about it, and how it was key that the process was country-owned and country-led. It was always important that we're not going to reinvent the wheel. So a key feature of our work was to draw on bodies of knowledge and policies and work that others had done previously. We touched on the NDC and the PCC's Just Transition Framework, but also work that came out of think tanks, academia, the labor union movement, and various other research that was available that we could draw on. The process had to be and was informed by expert reviews during the period of August to September this year, and where experts in the various fields, according to the 3 priority areas, subjected drafts of the policies or sections of the policies to scrutiny, and gave us inputs that helped refine and shape the plan as we went through. And that included also working groups of experts that were convened for this purpose. The process was also accompanied by a public consultation effort, which included, among others, labor, youth, business, the civil society, and local government, faith-based organizations, and so forth. And this was just the start of it. It's going to be an ongoing consultation process, particularly when we get to having to think carefully around implementation issues. And then, of course, the culmination of the process was having drafted the plan, workshopped it with international partners, presented to Cabinet for endorsement, and the aim is to announce this plan at COP27. Getting a little bit more into the plan itself, just to give you a sense of its building blocks. For the period that we're looking at, the first 5 years, the overall total required investment need across the 3 priority sectors, being electricity, new energy vehicles, and green hydrogen, is sitting at just shy of 1.5 trillion rands. And the portfolio has been constructed to deliver on South Africa's decarbonization objectives, as well as its essential social and economic and other environmental outcomes. And the portfolio of investments and that are contain these elements are interdependent. There is a clear sequencing and prioritization such that these investments and interventions are also enabling and reinforcing of each other. So there is a system approach that is being followed there, so that the impact could be similarly systemic and help us to transition in a sustainable way. We can move on to the next slide. I won't go through the detail of that. The slides obviously will be made available, and you'll see some of the detail around these 3 areas in terms of what the focus would be there. Yeah, I mean, the financing of a Jetp needs to also recognize that there is social costs that will be associated with us achieving this more ambitious NDC targets, and that there need to be trade-offs, and that the just transition in particular needs to be front and center as we consider the investments and where they should be focused. And when it comes to that, the goals are really to ensure that we grow new employment opportunities through economic growth and greater stability, that socioeconomic impediments are alleviated through improved access to energy and a reduction in energy poverty levels. And that, of course, we protect, as I said earlier, communities and workers that are heavily reliant on the coal value chain at the moment, and support them in the short term while securing their livelihoods in the future. And of course, the most affected region here that would require these transition initiatives is in Mpumalanga, where the bulk of our power stations are, and also the coal mines. And in each of these sectors, we make sure that the just component is elaborated upon and dealt with, and that there are cross-cutting priorities that have been also identified for skills development. And quite critically, and again, Crispin set the scene on this, the involvement of municipalities, very, very critical from a point of view, in particular, of implementation. If I go to the next slide, it just shows you, gives you a sense of the funding instruments that are going to be used in the plan, which can be deployed in their own right or in combination with others. The key is just that overall, these instruments that are chosen and how they're deployed respond to the environmental, social, and economic outcomes that are envisaged by the Jetp. As you can see, we're talking here about grants, concessional loans, budgetary support, blended finance, thematic bonds, and also market-related instruments, as I said, either individually or combined. And we also show how, in terms of implementing partners, these funds would flow. Clearly, there would be funds that would go directly to government, others would go to implementing institutions that could be state-owned enterprises, for instance, and the private sector might benefit from some of the funds or guarantees to facilitate and crowd in more funding there, and other social partners that would be potential. recipients or part of implementing this. And then if I talk to the next steps, which obviously is critical, I always say to colleagues who have been working very, very hard, the colleagues in the Secretariat, the support we got from the PCC, our own colleagues in the CFTT and all of that, that look, it feels like we are almost at the end with the investment plan, but meanwhile, the truth of the matter is that that's really just a ticket to the game. And we have to really start playing to win now with a relentless focus on implementation, which now needs to follow. And it is obviously very, very important. And specific interventions will need to be embarked upon and to support the strategic direction that the IP has given us, but in practical programs and implementation and development on the ground. And you can see some of the issues that we highlight there in terms of implementing entities that need to be identified so that they can access the capabilities institutions, the institutional needs. We need to make sure that we can track the progress overall of where we are going in terms of governance and oversight at management and political level. For that, we need to have structures that facilitate monitoring and evaluation so that, again, we can constantly check where we are on the journey, where we need to course correct, where we need to redouble our efforts and so forth. And of course, this access to finance, more granular work that needs to be done in terms of raising, implementing the current financing mechanism, but also widening the net to locate further finance facilities. And we have already got indications that a number of people that are willing to join and extend funding and financings to the plan. I have talked about the importance of governance and accountability earlier, such that we implement in a manner that gives people comfort and confidence to continue supporting us. So this will require ongoing engagements with various and between various stakeholders to ensure that we stay on track. And the last slide is really to briefly indicate that, you know, the model that we have embarked upon in terms of this Jetp, which is new, it's a groundbreaking project which may hopefully serve to guide others that are in similar positions. So in many respects, we're making our way as we go along. So there's nothing perfect in it, but it's a very important starting point. And we've already drawn valuable lessons and considerations as we interacted with each other in the various formations of people that are working on this and interacting with the financial offers. But the key issues around what the Jetp will contribute in helping address the climate emergency is that it will obviously contribute to the resilience building measures that we are undertaking as part of responding to climate risks. It will facilitate this whole society and whole economy approach that the Secretary of Parliament touched on earlier, where all the sectors are involved and all societal partners are part of the process. And it obviously recognized that, you know, fossil fuel dependent countries such as ours require significant support to transition. We can't do it by ourselves, and it's going to be important that we keep reminding our partners and holding them accountable to their obligations under the Paris Climate Agreement. And we need to make sure that the Jetp represents one of, as I said, it's one of its first in terms of the country level, but it needs to be country owned. It needs to speak to specifically to our needs and driven by those as we try to articulate in the financing principles and in the preferred terms and conditions that were uniquely developed for our circumstances in South Africa. And we need to make sure that the just transition approach and the intersectoral approach is weaved through the entire process as we look at our portfolios of investments and various interventions that will go with that. And obviously we need to be alive to the fact that an investment plan as it exists today needs to evolve, it needs to be dynamic, it needs to respond to the environment as it unfolds, given that this is a journey of multiple decades, and the preparedness to adjust and refine and course correct becomes very important. So thank you very much. I will leave it at that. As I've indicated, the plan that was approved yesterday will be made available to the general public. A lot more details will be contained in that in terms of the scale of need, the financing. It'll put into context much more visibly what Crispin was talking about earlier around the quantum of this 8.5 billion versus the overall scale of need over the period that we're talking about. It will speak to our evaluation criteria, how we prioritize, how across the various 3 identified priority areas the funding or investments will be distributed. It will give detail as to the instruments and the country contributions from our partners in supporting this. So it's a document that hopefully you'll all find very interesting to read, and when it comes out, and find that it'll help us on our way to transition South Africa to a more resilient economy and also more climate resilient society. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kenele.
Yeah, I think a final word, maybe just to say that I concur fully with what Crispin was saying in relation to the role that Parliament can play as one of our most important institutions of our democracy. But it's not just parliaments in terms of our representatives there. There's a role for each and every one of us, whether we're institutions, whether we're private individuals. This climate emergency needs all of us to join hands and respond.
Thank you, sir, and thank you for those final words as well. Financing the just energy transition is arguably one of the biggest challenges, I think, particularly for developing countries such as ours, or developing economies. And no doubt there will be ongoing discussions and negotiations and provisions of plans, as you indicated, both domestic and international, on this aspect well into the future. I'm also encouraged and would want to welcome further questions in the Q&A function, and also just call on panelists to please have a look at the questions that have been posed and provide written answers as may be appropriate. We had next on our program to focus on gender and climate change with a presentation by a commissioner from the Commission for Gender Equality. But unfortunately, due to unforeseen circumstances, the colleague is not available today at short notice. So in the interest of time, we'll move directly on to looking at South Africa's position in terms of the Conference of the Parties, the 27th session. And we indeed are honored to have Honorable Tracy, who is the Minister of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment. Over to you, Honorable Minister.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon to everybody on the platform. And thank you for giving me this opportunity to provide an update on what we're expecting will happen in the climate negotiations at COP27. Chair of the session, I'm in a rural area, so you will also advise me if my broadband is not holding up, and I might then switch off my camera. But let me say at the outset that the Paris Agreement binds all countries to 3 commitments. The first would be a commitment to reducing their greenhouse gases. The second would be a commitment to building climate resilience within their countries. And we also refer to climate resilience as adaptation. And the third area that we all commit to is creating the means of implementation for our domestic commitments. Now, as everybody knows, the Paris Agreement binds members to working together to maintain the global average temperature increase below 2 degrees. And I think that the 6th scientific IPCC panel has really confirmed that it would be better to try and limit global temperature increases to 1.5 degrees. What we also know from the IPCC report is that South Africa is one of the regions in the world that is extremely vulnerable to climate change. Firstly, because our average temperature increases are warming at twice the global rate. And secondly, because we have a very mega biodiverse country. And so we have almost all of the negative impacts of climate change. We have increasing rainfall on the eastern side of our country, which makes us prone to flooding and storm surges. We have increasing dryness in the western half of our country, which makes us increasingly prone to drought, heat waves, and of course, going with heat waves goes wildfires. And we know that South Africa also has 3,500 kilometers of coastline, and the consequence of that is that many of our coastal towns and cities are vulnerable to sea level rise. So we, together with all countries on the African continent, face this incredibly difficult challenge that we are, all of us, already living through climate change. And not only have we seen devastating droughts and floods in our own country, but we are seeing devastating droughts and floods across the African country that are, in the case of the Horn of Africa, putting over 250 million people at risk of food insecurity. Now, COP27 has been dubbed the African COP. And so, of course, African countries that are organized together under the African Group of Negotiators would be very keen that this COP addresses the special circumstances of the African continent. And by the special circumstances, we're referring really to all the issues I've already raised, the vulnerability of the African continent to climate change. And what you would also know is that historically, the African continent has contributed less than 4% to accumulated global emissions. And what that means is that we are very, very vulnerable to climate change, but the countries that are facing this extreme vulnerability have contributed the least to the problem. The second area in relation to these special circumstances really relates to the economic circumstances of Africa. And what we understand is that the continent as a whole is a developing continent. While some of the countries on the continent may be defined like our own country as a middle income country, what we know is that there are vast inequalities in African middle income countries. And we know that all of the continent's countries have widespread poverty, widespread inequality, and of course, high rates of unemployment. And what that means is that the African continent is in the most difficult position when it comes to financing the consequences of climate change. So these are the special circumstances of Africa, our extreme vulnerability to climate change, the fact that historically our countries have contributed the least to causing the problem of climate change, and yet our countries on the continent are the most vulnerable. And then on the other side, the economic challenges that we have. And so what we expect is that COP27 has got to make significant progress on, I think, 3 areas. The first area would be this question of adaptation. The second would be the question of delivering on the scale of finance. And the third would be the whole question of dealing with loss and damage. And I think these, for African countries, are going to be the very hot topics of debate at COP27. Now, let me say that on adaptation, for a number of years now, there has been a debate. What do we mean about adaptation? And developing countries generally, and Africa in particular, have fought extremely hard to get the issue of adaptation onto the main agenda of the Conference of the Parties, and to make progress on defining what we mean by the adaptation agenda. And what we're saying is that we need to have very clear goals. South Africa has repeatedly suggested that just as we aim to halve greenhouse gases by 2030, so we should aim to halve the vulnerability of developing countries to the climate emergency by the 2030s. And we continue to argue that we do need these clear, quantifiable goals with regard to adaptation. Now, when one talks about adaptation, one inevitably then has to start to talk about finance. And what we know is that developed countries have not honored their own commitments that they made in relation to the financing of climate transitions by developing countries. At Paris, developed countries committed to raising $1 billion per annum for transitions, both in the area of mitigation and adaptation. What we know is that to date, only about $85 billion have been raised. And we also know that only about 10% of that money has been available for adaptation. Now, what we all understand is that if countries don't adapt quickly to the realities of climate change, then questions of loss and damage become ever more significant. And if you have to take our own experience over the past year, what we can see is that the terrible damage that occurred during the flooding in KwaZulu-Natal in April, and that a lot of that damage was because there are backlogs in human settlement. You had people settled in places where it was not safe for them to have lived. You had a range of other infrastructure that was destroyed, roads, bridges, and so on. Now, all of that requires that we need to be implementing much more speedily adaptation strategies in those areas of our country that are prone to either flooding or droughts and all the other climate emergencies that I've mentioned. And if we don't take those kind of proactive steps, then obviously, as was the case in the floods in April, the consequences are very dire for African countries and for African economies. So we are saying that it's very important that there needs to be a new financing goal agreed to at COP27, that this new financing goal needs to ensure that there's adequate grant financing available for African countries and other developing countries, and that the manner in which this financing comes needs to be reliable and predictable. And I think that we are particularly concerned, and it's why I'm raising the grant component, that the way in which financing comes, both for adaptation and mitigation, should not be adding to the already indebted status of many African countries. You would also know that there is going to be a lot of debate at COP27 about the issue of loss and damage. And a lot of this debate will be led by the small island states, countries that are already facing rising sea levels and destruction of their coastal infrastructure. And I think that they are calling for immediate operationalization of the Santiago network for loss and damage, particularly those aspects related to technical support. But they're also saying that there has to be clarity on how are countries going to be able to access financial support, what will be the regulatory mechanisms, and when will the UNFCCC set up the supervisory body that is going to regulate these mechanisms of loss and damage. So this we're expecting is going to be a difficult issue at the conference. And then coming to the question of mitigation, I think that you know that South Africa submitted our revised NDCs in October last year. I think that we have expressed concern, and we expressed this concern when we participated in the Berlin dialogue and also in the pre-COP meeting that took place in the DRC a couple of weeks ago, that we wouldn't like to see a situation where developed countries are reneging on their climate commitments. And we certainly wouldn't want to see a situation where developed countries are not only reneging on their climate commitments, but they are trying to shift some of their responsibilities onto developing countries. South Africa is clear that over the next 30 years, we will have to have a transition away from our current high carbon footprint. But we are also saying that that transition has to be at a pace that our economy can afford, and that it can only take place if we are going to receive significant financing from developed countries, and if developed countries are going to honor their financial commitments, both to mitigation and to adaptation. So I think that everybody is going to be watching this space very closely to see whether or not there might be a difficulty with regard to developed countries reneging on their climate commitments. Chairperson, I wouldn't want to speak for much longer. I think one has tried to answer in overview what the key issues would be. I mean, there are other issues to deal with, the implementation of Article 6 and capacity development and other issues, but I think these cover the main issues that will be on the table for discussion in the negotiations. Thank you very much.
Minister, thank you, and please accept our appreciation for sharing your insights on the key issues for discussion at COP27, certainly from a South African perspective. And very importantly and very interestingly, the interplay between responses to climate change and the disproportionate vulnerabilities, particularly in developing countries such as ourselves. I think it's a nice segue to our next presentation on the role of Parliament in the United Nations Climate Change Fora, which will be given by Honourable Froelich, who is House Chairperson of Committees Oversight and ICT. Thank you, Minister, and over to you, Honourable Froelich.
No, good afternoon to you, Dr. Gabriel, and thank you for your team who have now successfully implemented, I think it must be the 4th webinar that we are doing on climate change. And that illustrates the importance of our Parliament. Both the National Assembly and the Council of Provinces are viewing the dilemma and crisis of climate change. May I also acknowledge on the platform the presence and the presentation of the Honourable Minister, who has given us a very, very broad outline in terms of the issues that may arise there and the approach that will be taken. And thank you, Honourable Minister. I also want to recognize now in absentia the Secretary to Parliament, who welcomed all of us, and the Secretary had to leave to attend to other pressing matters. And then also an old friend and acquaintance, Dr. Olver, from the Presidential Climate Change Commission. And I also want to recognize then Mr. Minele, who is looking at the climate finance aspects. Program Director, may I start by indicating that on the 2nd of June this year, the National Assembly adopted a resolution to set up a climate change steering committee, a joint steering committee with the National Council of Provinces. And this has been informed by the recognition from all of us, all political parties and stakeholders in Parliament, that climate change and global warming have become the priorities for South Africa as well as the global community. And we've also noticed as parliamentarians that over the years, the government of the country has made a number of commitments to combat climate change in the context of a just transition and sustainable development. And we also further noted that Parliament require a coordinated, consultative approach to ensure that we can oversee and contribute to South Africa's climate strategy. It was therefore resolved that this joint committee be set up, and it will be for the duration of the 6th Parliament until it comes to an end in 2023. It has the primary task to facilitate the coordination of parliamentary activities related to climate change, and also to facilitate the joint parliamentary program of action to prioritize climate change issues and commitments. Now, the Minister has referred to loss and damage, and I am co-chairing an ad hoc committee that is currently looking into the conditions as well as the support to revive the economy in the 3 provinces that has been affected by the April floods. Those provinces are KZN, especially the eThekwini region, also the Eastern Cape and the Northwest. And what this has done is, participants and attendees here on this platform, was to show us the brutal face of the impact of climate change. Overnight, the situation, especially in KwaZulu-Natal, changed for a number of people, and once again, the poorest of the poor were most affected. But climate change is also very indiscriminate. It affected all spheres of life, and it wiped out key infrastructure as well as livelihoods of people, and it's coupled with a loss of life of more than 500 citizens of especially KwaZulu-Natal. This has led to a deeper discussion to look at the preparedness of our province in terms of disaster management, but also of the municipalities to deal, to mitigate, and also to adapt to climate change. And what we have seen is, and it is widely acknowledged, that our country is not ready and was not ready to deal with the devastation that accompanied the floods in April this year. The president declared it a national disaster, and all the relief efforts were put in place. But what we require now, and the report that will come out will highlight that, is the coordination that is required by the different spheres of government, as well as the responsibilities from each sphere of government. On the chat group, and in terms of the questions that has been asked, one of the questions that's been asked refers to the climate change bill that is currently in front of the Portfolio Committee on Forestry, Fisheries, and the Environment. The climate change bill is in the process and at the point where it will go towards the public hearing stage, where some people who have made submissions to Parliament will be invited to come and give oral submissions. And there's been a number and a range of written submissions that has been given. The committee will thus interact to see whether the climate change bill cover all these salient features that is raised by our citizens, but also meet the objective of government. The process is thus unfolding, it's continuing. And when you go onto the parliamentary website and you look at the programs of committees, it clearly indicates there the process as I've explained to you. We envisage that this climate change bill will be finalized by the National Assembly early next year. Afterwards, it will go to the National Council of Provinces, also to deal with the matters pertains to the provincial competencies. The Steering Committee on Climate Change will thus work in conjunction with the Portfolio Committee on Forestry, Fisheries, and the Environments, and will play a supportive role to ensure that on the one hand, the legislation is developed by the committee, but on the other hand, we arrange different types of interactions and consultation, as we do today, with stakeholders, with members of government, and also of other entities that play a role in this regard. This process will continue even after the bill is finally processed by the National Assembly. So the question that arises, what is the role of Parliament? Where do Parliament really fit in? And I think Dr. Olver in his presentation highlighted the crucial role that parliamentarians can play in terms of the just transition. He also focused on the accountability aspect, keeping the executive accountable, the integration aspect, the legislation that needs to be developed and put in place, and the governance and responsibilities in terms of the different tiers of government. The role of Parliament is not restricted to this. The role of Parliament is to critically look into and analyze whatever the government put in front of us, and some of the issues that already has arisen as we prepare as parliamentarians going to COP27 is adaptation, mitigation, loss and damage, and then the big one for us is climate finance. In the presentation of Mr. Minele, He explained the process where they are, and that we'll soon get more detail in terms of the financial architecture of what has been put on the table by the United States, the UK, the EU, and Germany. Earlier this year, in the State of the Nation address, we referred to the importance of additional finance. And we asked questions whether it's a grant, whether it's a loan, whether it's a soft loan, or whether it's concessions. And as it is emerging now, it seems as if it is a loan, and that the private sector will play a big role in terms of the processes that must distribute and implement the architecture that will be decided upon. We, as parliamentarians, are mindful of the fact that we must guard against putting future generations in perpetual debt towards the rich countries, because ultimately the architecture is co-determined by those who make the funding available in whichever form it is. The finance mix still suits, and it still works in favor of the richer countries of the world, because they have written the rules in terms of finance. What we want to avoid at COP is what has happened in the past, is that certain international events overtake the focus that should be on the discussions. In the recent past, in attending international gatherings, the attention has shifted towards the conflict and war between Russia and Ukraine, and the billions of US dollars that's committed to this war. If such a lot of money indeed is freely available, then it will make a huge dent in terms of the commitments that has been made prior to the Paris Agreement, and afterwards in terms of the contributions of the rich countries in the world that has been primarily responsible for the effects of climate change due to the past practices and policies that they've had. It is thus important that we will have to maintain a focus on the work that needs to be done, and that the priorities, as I referred to, receive due attention. Prior to and during the climate change conference COP27, as in the past, multi-party delegation of parliamentarians from the National Assembly and the National Council of Provinces will attend a range of other meetings and gatherings where they will be able to interact with parliamentarians at the COP27 conference. At this point, we must recognize and express our appreciation once again to the government and Minister Creasy for including a delegation of members of parliament from both houses in the country delegation that will attend COP27. This is certainly a deviation from a lot of other countries, leading countries in the world, that do not include members of parliament in the country delegation. This provides members an opportunity on a lot of different platforms and side events to interact with like-minded and differently minded members of parliament in terms of the negotiation process and what is expected from it. We do find, Honorable Minister, that members of parliament have more leeway in discussions and be more open and frank. And it's sometimes difficult for the negotiators to deal with some of these issues very upfront and straightforward, while members discuss it freely in these other platforms that are there. It thus plays a complementary role to that of the government position. And over the past years, we have seen that all the political parties in parliament agree and support the government approach and position around climate change. COP27, it will not be different, although the urgency from members is great because of the impact that we can see in different parts of the country and also the world of climate change and its consequences. At COP27, the members will thus attend the Global Legislators Forum on the Environment called GLOBE, the Interparliamentary Union, the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association, and the Climate Parliament. And we have already in the past, and this year it will be the same, have bilateral meetings with, amongst other, members of parliament from the European Union, the Nordic countries, India, China, as well as countries from the African bloc. We do find that statements and declarations that come from these different forums reinforce the progressive agenda that should emerge from the COP27. And we sincerely hope that this year we will remain focused and that the sticky issue of finance, climate finance, commitments by the major industrial countries of the world, the rich countries of the world, that they do not turn back on the previous commitments that was given, but stick to the agreed processes, but also implementation of what has been agreed on before. And with those few words, I thank you, Program Director.
Thank you, Honorable House Chairperson, for those elaborations on the role of Parliament and parliamentarians, not only domestically, but also internationally. Staying in that vein, we have now one of our parliamentary researchers who specializes in environment, forestry, and fisheries, Mr. Slanta Ganinza, who will delve a little bit more into the potential of the climate change bill, and then also look at integrated oversight, which you touched on as well on the Oversight. Ms. Slanta, over to you.
Thank you, Chairperson. Let me share this screen. Okay. I'm not sure whether it's appearing that side. The connection is not really that clear.
We can see your slides. Thank you. Please proceed.
Okay. Yeah, I will be focusing on a slightly different aspect of these climate change issues. But at the end of the day, if there's something that is a take-home message, it should be this slide about South Africa's realities. What we have now is the high level of poverty and inequality that persists in the country. For example, we have more than 55% of people living in abject poverty. And then you have the issue of high unemployment rate, where the expanded definition puts it in excess of 44%. And then we have about 35% of the citizens falling into the middle income group or middle class. And from the studies that we've seen, including the needs cram, it shows that about 60% of those people are very vulnerable to fall into the poverty group. The only thing that is sustaining them is about 2 months worth of salary, which means if we consider the poverty level or the poverty bracket is actually much bigger than what is currently considered to be the formal report. And then you have the issue of food insecurity. About 50% of South Africans go to bed hungry. That's about 30 million people. That's a high number. And it should be one of the things that are treated as an urgent issue. Then we have one of the persistent challenge around poor governance. If you look at the AG's reports, they paint a bleak picture. You look at where South Africa ranks in terms of corruption index. And then you also look at the amount of monies that cannot be fully accounted for example, from the Commission of Inquiries. These are realities that we have that have a direct bearing on our ability to adapt or mitigate the impacts of climate change. I will skip the mid-column part for now, which is around the financial troubles, and go to the section which is number 3, the climate change realities. Honorable Frolick has touched a little bit on what has been happening, but one of the things that I want to look at, focus on that one, is our ability to bounce back because it's one thing that we are not we're not prepared, then it's also another challenge when we are not able to bounce back. If you look at all the infrastructure that got damaged from the floods has not been restored, there's still talks around them. And from what we are getting from the scientific reports is that the frequency and the intensity of these extreme events are going to be on the increase. So what does that mean? It has a direct bearing on poverty. It has direct bearing on inequality and unemployment. For example, if there are failures in agricultural production, whether it's livestock or any other crops, it has the loop effect on these stubborn challenges, which I think is one of the things that need to be considered. For example, alien invasive species are gradually eating up agricultural land, and the impact of the environmental programs in fighting invasive species do not seem to be winning, partly because of the limitations that have to do with the finances and maybe others which has to do with the contract management. But the point that I'm driving is that climate change is not, the impacts are not waiting for tools to be developed. They're already here. Actually, we are far behind in terms of our preparedness as a country. And we are going to, given like the intensity that is predicted, to be in big trouble if nothing drastic is done. And then when you just look at, for example, where we are with our finances, some of the speakers have already touched around the risk of us possibly not get a favorable interest when looking at the finances going out there. It gets complicated. Then we have to look at ourselves, what do we have? And part of that one is the prudent use of the resources that we have as a country. For example, there's currently a wider range of what is required for just transition, whether it's 4 trillion, whether it's 8 trillion, that's a lot of money. We're not making that kind of money as a country. And given the competing needs in terms of finances in the country, it needs us to look at mechanisms to ensure that we get value for money on any project that is out there, including those ones that are focused on infrastructure. Then we have the issue on the reneging on commitments that was made by the developed countries. But there are some things that are done in relation to that. This particularly looks at the progress that the country has done. I'll just focus on this small one in relation to our climate change response strategy of the country. Everything they've already mentioned, the finance framework that has been out. In general, as a country, we are very good at producing these documents, but very little can be pointed at in terms of achievements and impact on the ground. So what climate change and recently from the impacts of COVID has shown is that we need sometimes to implement things even when we have half-cooked plans. Because just imagine if we had to wait for perfect plans to respond to the impacts of COVID, maybe the impacts would be much worse than where we are now. There can be different arguments on that, whether they will get value for money, but there should be something. The point that I want to drive here is that in this phase of just transition, Parliament should be focused on these aspects, that when the just transition happens, we should not lose sight of the developmental mandate that government has, and that it should be transformational in a sense of being inclusive and changing the current ownership patterns of means of production and economic activities. And it should be informed by evidence, that decisions should not be just abrupt. There should be some evidence backing the directions that we are taking as a country. And there comes the aspect of cost effectiveness. When you look at the capacity of municipalities, which is where most of these impacts are felt, the financial stewardship at those levels not really up there. And it's one of the things that the oversight mechanisms of Parliament may need to intensify on, so that we can get more value for money, because the rent that we have cannot be stretched very long. Then there's the other aspect of the integrated and alignment in the different spheres of government. This is not only for government, but it can also apply to the legislative sector, the integrated approach among committees and between different legislatures. So in relation to where we are now, it's the part of the bill, the strategic aspect of it, that it seeks to reduce the risks of job losses. That's one of the aspects. When you look at the coal value chain, I can roughly say maybe the numbers, it supports around 250,000 jobs. When you look at the 90,000 that comes from the direct employment there, and the associated supporting sectors making about 150 to 180,000. Those jobs are currently largely in the Highveld side of the country. And with the commitment of the country to transition away from coal, it means that you have, let's just use a figure, 250,000 jobs. 250,000 jobs, when you put the multiplier factor on that one of 2 to 3 dependents, it easily jumps to about 750,000. Those are roughly the number of people that you are looking at that could be impacted by a poorly calculated transition away from coal, which is why I like some of the comments from the speakers that the transition, while we need immediate action, but it also needs to consider the social and the economic impact of that one. In relation to this one, on the changes of the jobs, like transitioning to greener jobs, it's a little bit concerning when you look at the study from the CSIR that points that the jobs in the green economy sphere are mostly temporary jobs, about 80% of them, mostly in the initial stages. And that is a worrying concern which Parliament has to closely look at and ensure that the impact is minimized and where possible eliminated at all. The bill seeks, among other things, to look at those issues, and particularly around driving a unified policy position, because it's also disheartening sometimes to hear different positions or different views from government, others saying this is what needs to be done, others that's what needs to be done. I think that's one of the things that need to be looked at. The bill is currently processed, as Honorable Frolik has responded to that one. And we have in excess of 13,000 inputs that has come from the public. There's great interest in the bill, partly because climate impacts affect everyone. There's no one that is not really affected by it. It's either you are threatened with day zero in other areas of the country, or others is landslides, and other agricultural areas, it's the issue of jobs possibly getting diminished. Already the agricultural sector is no longer employing the number of jobs, no longer employing the number of people that it had 10, 20 years ago. And now climate change is also accelerating that. The loss of jobs or the underperformance of that sector, which is one of the areas that Parliament needs to closely look at, particularly the alternative livelihood strategies that will assist people to adapt to new forms of livelihood. And in terms of the composition of the input, we've not finished processing all 13,000 inputs because the committee is currently working on the Field and Forest Fire Bill, which is approaching its on the climate change bill. There's quite a lot of useful, insightful input that came from stakeholders that seek to impact either directly the content of the bill or on the side of the regulations or guidelines that need to be considered when moving towards its implementation. But the agency is there for the bill to be finalized, but we don't need the bill to be finalized before actions get done. There's already clarity when you look at all the adaptation and mitigation strategies that the country has, direction on what needs to be done. And I'm glad that there's movement also from the financing side. Parliament has mechanisms to oversee and ensure accountability. And in this, the sixth parliament, there are some of the outcomes or the impact-driven outcomes that parliament is looking at is the reduction of poverty, unemployment, and inequality. These ones, it means that if they are not achieved, they are also a direct reflection on parliament's effectiveness. And each and every step that of the chain, every part of the chain there, requires a little bit more effort than what is currently happening when you consider the agency that is imposed by climate change impacts. And for example, when you look at these aspects, how much involved ordinary South Africans are in the constituency work of individual members, or how much they are involved in the oversight work of committees, or in the plenary activities. It's a mixed bag, but I think the assessment on whether Parliament is doing enough or is excelling or is underperforming, the assessment of that one will need to be a thing that is considered so that there's certain standards that committees need to have, whether it's from the input side all the way up to impact assessment of the work of Parliament. And I want to go into the execution of the core mandate of Parliament, but there's some of the things that in terms of operations that seem to be coming through is the need for integrated oversight across committees. Because when you look at climate change, it's not an environmental matter. It actually has a lot to do with people. When you look at the possibility of diseases, when you look at the migration that comes with climate change, the food or food insecurity that comes with climate change, you already see that there's way more committees that are needed. And then there's the aspect, the gendered aspects of climate change. When you look there, women and children are the most vulnerable and the most affected ones by climate change. Then it speaks to where Parliament should also focus in terms of its work around oversight and monitoring of the work of government. And the other one is, of course, the one that I've already touched on, the overseeing of the shift towards green economic activities. South Africa needs to move towards greener economic activities for our own good, as well as for continued access to international market. We rely a lot on trade. And given that, like some of the things that Honorable Frolik was saying, that we do not always dictate the conditions of either financing or access to those markets. So then now we are now forced. Because for example, if our coal or industries that rely a lot on intensive emissions are going to be penalized, then it has a ripple effect down the chain on those triple challenges that we have, or 4 challenges that we have as a country. And then we'll look, the other part will be on the reskilling and the sustainable job creation. I like one of the things that the previous speakers spoke of some kind of coordination, because there's currently some disjointed efforts that are ongoing in different places. I think there will be greater impact if efforts were pulled together. And then it's the part of strengthening governance in the public sector, and implementation of corrective action and consequence management. This is one of the issues that is very critical when you consider that there is a possibility of monies being spent at municipal level for adaptation or mitigation. If municipalities cannot account for the monies that they have or they use currently, then it means that we might have a bigger problem when going into the future, because as much as we have other institutions that are responsible for the finances at operational level, municipalities are right at the cold face of this, where this is experienced. And then the other part is more of the cooperation from the side of Parliament with provincial legislatures, as I mentioned, but also with non-governmental organizations, think tanks, and civil society. Because one of the things that Parliament does not have all the capacity to respond to all these issues related to climate change. So the capacity from these different institutions will help a lot in supporting or enabling Parliament to do its work a little bit better. And then the other one has to do with the transparency and accountability. Not everything needs to be processed through PIA. And dashboards can be created so that information around what is being done, polluters, and everything that has to do with just transition. For example, the way it's done in the Pakistas, where you have the dashboards on these reports, that needs to be one of those adopted approaches. Yeah, and then the last one relating to capacity enhancement here in Parliament is one of those things that need to be looked at. Thank you, Chairperson.
Thank you, Mr. Kununza, for elaborating on the oversight focus of Parliament, not only in terms of the approach, but also some of the specifics. Thank you very much for that. And that feeds very nicely into our next presentation by the African Climate Alliance, that will look at the impact of climate change on natural resources, and of very specific interest to us as an institution, obviously, to look at some recommended oversight areas for Parliament. So I invite Ms. Michelle Marker. Please, ma'am, go ahead.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invite. So it's actually Michelle. Dad's idea to put the T in there. Yeah, so I think a lot of things we've already heard, right? For instance, we've already heard, and it's been previously highlighted, what Parliament's constitutional function is. And it is to protect and defend our constitutional order. And we can look at this as the rights of everyone in South Africa, our natural resources, as well as our well-being. Second is that, so after realizing Parliament's vital constitutional function, we then move to realizing that now Parliament needs to be in a position where it is capacitated, or it capacitates itself so that it can fulfill this function. Right, so we need to start saying a few things come from Parliament. We need to see Parliament acknowledging its role in addressing the climate crisis through the mobilization of all our public representatives so that they can address this crisis, which is local as well as global. So with all this, we come to this problem. How can we, or how are we going to do this, right? And there are 4 key areas that we can sort of look at. One is that Parliament must be in a position or must adapt its internal legislative architecture and operating structures in a way that is grand and directly proportional to the threat of the climate crisis, which will ensure that Parliament is capacitated to fulfill its functions, like I mentioned earlier, safeguarding our constitutional order and protecting our nation. This can be looked at as recommendations, and I'll just mention a few. The first is that we need to see Parliament establish the permanent joint standing committee on the climate and ecological crisis, which would meet 4 times a year. We can look at this as once per quarter, right? Second is that Parliament would introduce a climate risk tagging mechanism into the parliamentary legislative process so that all legislation is assessed and analyzed to ensure that it aligns and conforms with our laws on climate change, as well as our response to it. And then we need to see all members of Parliament being mandated to complete a compulsory educational module on the climate crisis as soon as they're in office within the first year of office. And then Parliament should set up a large and visible climate clock within the parliamentary precinct and would be viewable by the public. This clock would be a climate countdown. We can look at it as showing how much time South Africa has left to achieve its net zero carbon emissions, as well as our remaining carbon budget until the year 2050. We should also see a similar setup within the National Assembly Chamber and the National Council of Provinces, all of which should be Parliament's responsibility. And then, so that was just the first recommendation. The second would be that we must see Parliament exercising executive oversight on climate change within the presidency and state institution without fear or favor. We need to see 2 things happen under this, right? The first is that we need it to be executive oversight existing within a climate policy window, informed by our Bill of Rights and environmental protections under Section 24 of our Constitution. And second being that Parliament must be positioned to take measures and intervene rapidly in the event that the executive fails to devise an appropriate and response to climate change in terms of adaptation and mitigation. We've heard a lot of references around mitigation and adaptation, around the conversation of loss and damage, and even climate finance. The third is that we need to be in a position where we see Parliament passing a climate change bill that shows foresight, is fit for purpose, and can exist sustainably beyond these narrow political terms of office that we currently have. The bill must constitute the non-negotiable achievement of net zero carbon emissions by the year 2050. Simply put, it must put human rights and considerations as the core and fundamental part to its function, right? So this is just some of the things that we're looking at. And then lastly, we need to be in a position where we see public participation in the response to climate change not being limited to the parliamentary legislative process. And what I'm saying is that Parliament must mobilize each and every one of its resources at its disposal to make sure that all members of Parliament are able to urgently raise awareness to the threat and climate change, to the threat that climate change poses to our society and how government plans to respond to this threat. So then now we might be wondering, how then does this even sort of relate to natural resources and that sort of thing? But climate change doesn't only threaten our environment, it threatens people. And this is where Parliament's role in ensuring that our rights as people are protected and that we can tackle the problem of climate change in a holistic way, really just looking at the important role that the Parliament has to play in this. So before I sort of move into a conclusion, I want to bring a few things to everyone's attention, right? The first is the WWF Living Planet report, and the second would be the IBP ES Global Assessment Report, which have made it clear that urgently acting to ensure that the decline of nature is stopped is obviously going to stop the decline of nature. and that there's been an average decline in species of about 69% in population sizes since 1970. Going to show that the natural world and biodiversity is plummeting, and that must be urgently protected in order to preserve our natural resources, biodiversity, and Earth systems that are key to life on our planet. So why is it then that the South African government, or South Africa as a country, has not yet put its signature on the Leaders' Pledge for Nature under the Convention on Biodiversity? Moving on, the aforementioned IBPES global assessment offers that up to 1 million species are at risk of extinction by the year 2050 unless urgent action is taken. It is then very, very vital for the polluter pays principle to be strictly enforced, and that ecological costs of extractive economies as well as production processes are fully internalized, and corporations must be made to pay the full cost of the activities and the toll on the natural environment. We have heard throughout previous presentations how climate change in the form of natural disasters, like we saw in KZN and other provinces through droughts and other such things, has displaced millions of people, increased houselessness or homelessness, food security being worsened, and the implied harms on the environment. All of this will be worse, and more is coming, and we will not be prepared for the impacts we're going to be confronted by. Parliament is not going to be prepared either unless we act, and we act now. We need to protect our natural resources, humans, the environment, and our biodiversity alike. So all this really just one shows the role of Parliament, which I feel that was not clearly sort of outlined, and some recommendations around that. And then the relationship between our natural resources, including people under that bracket, to the climate crisis that is coming. And with that, I would like to say thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Maka, very much for those concrete, innovative, and yet practical proposals or recommendations to Parliament. Part of our capacity building for members and officials of Parliament is also to partner with civil society organizations in terms of knowledge, expertise, and also just documentation. So we certainly will be following up on these kinds of partnerships. You touched a little bit on rights, and our next presenter, Mr. Brandon Abdinal, will take a closer look at a rights-based approach to climate change. He is from the Center for Environmental Rights. Brandon, over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks to you and the honourable members for this opportunity. It's quite a relief to see that the climate emergency is being discussed at an overarching parliamentary level, and in an uncomfortable way, it's a relief to see that the word emergency is being used, because that is what we are talking about. Those of us in the space, and many of you will kind of see this fact over and over, and one almost gets a bit numb to it, but the bottom line is that the science tells us we need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 45% by 2030, and we'll have heard from a number of the presentations reach net zero by 2050, and we can't forget this. This is not something that can be bargained with. It's not the climate. It's not going to wait for us to get climate financing or get political will in place and that sort of thing. And we understand the complexity, but this is the basic reality that we need to be guided by. We heard from Minister Creasy and Mr. Kinenza what the impacts are, so I won't go over them again, but these come from science once again, and you'll see that the lists presented by different speakers very much overlap. What do those impacts mean in terms of risks? So we're looking at risks to food security, prices and availability of water, displacement, climate migration and refugees, which in turn can lead to conflict and civil unrest, damage to infrastructure, human settlements, and an enormous risk to health and safety. We've heard from Dr. Olver and Mr. Manele around the economic risks, such as the EU's carbon border adjustment mechanism and climate finance. And what do these impacts and risks mean for our rights? Well, the obvious one is section 24, which is our right to a safe and healthy environment. There's never been a threat to the environment like climate change. And really it's the environment that gives us the ability to be alive on this planet. So that one in a sense speaks for itself. We can see from the nature of those impacts that the rights of access to food and water are also impacted, as well as the rights to life, dignity, freedom, and security of the person. We heard earlier on as well, I think from Honorable Frolica, the poorest of the poor get impacted by climate change, and unfortunately that's the absolute truth. Ultimately we all do, but it's these at-risk groupings and communities that really bear the brunt of it quite often, and that impacts on the rights to equality and discrimination. And although we're seeing the impacts of the climate crisis hit us right now already, they're going to get worse, and really it's the next generations that are going to be dealing with even worse impacts if we don't act accordingly and appropriately. And on that basis, the rights to children, rights of children to have their best interests made paramount are also impacted. So that's quite a considerable chunk of our Bill of Rights. And these arguments are going to be before the North Gauteng High Court in the near future, where they will be unpacked in more detail. So decarbonization, or mitigation, if you like, is obviously a foundational element of climate response. And this starts to tie into where Parliament can have and needs to have an important oversight. So we have our mitigation commitments via our nationally determined contributions, but we're still seeing a widespread push for gas to power electricity regime. We're still seeing intensifying exploration for oil and gas. The DMRE is still attempting to have new coal-fired power built. We're seeing carbon-intensive developments such as the MMSEZ receiving government support. And all of these activities are extremely harmful to the climate, among other factors. So these actions really show still the very fragmented nature of the approach to mitigation and climate response in general. And here's where Parliament and the right sort of oversight could be really important. The climate bill that we've heard quite a bit about today already provides for carbon budgets and sectoral emissions targets, but it's unclear exactly when the act is going to come into being. It needs to be urgently, and I think many today have echoed that. But we don't know what sort of buy-in there yet. The bill, in our opinion, is a little deficient in that there are no timeframes for these mechanisms. And ultimately, the bill is weak in terms of compliance. It relies on a higher carbon tax rate for excessive greenhouse gas emissions, but we need to see strict and clear offences and penalties in order for climate change laws to be taken seriously. We can't be in a position where emitters choose to pay to continue emitting, because ultimately the climate and people will suffer. We can see from the nature of these impacts and the range of risks that we need an all-of-government approach. We cannot have a situation where all of the responsibility resides with the DFFE or within one ministry. We believe it's appropriate that ministry is the coordinator, but we need everyone to have buy-in. The IPCC 6 assessment report confirms this, that ministries of the environment are often appointed as the coordinators, but don't necessarily have the budget or the bargaining power. So we need buy-in across the board. We need political will. And again, this is Parliament can come in and ensure that the right prioritization, that the right efforts are put on the table. The bill that we do have, just one very simple clause in the bill, says that every organ of state that exercises a power or performs a function that is affected by climate change must review, revise, amend, coordinate, and harmonize their policies. Quite a small clause, but there's an immense amount of work that goes into this. And again, we can't have a situation where DFE are sort of begging and pleading and sort of haggling to have these actions taken. And again, parliamentary oversight is going to be important to ensure that all of the ministries, all of the departments, all of the state come on board and prioritize this sufficiently. So some of the suggestions we put forward in our submission on the climate change bill, we say that a sound science-led and ongoing oversight by Parliament is essential. And some ideas around this Parliament should receive and consider a biannual report from the Environmental Minister, as well as other key ministries involved with climate change. Finance Minister and National Treasury should create a dedicated climate change component in or supplement to the national budget for climate change response. Ministries should create focal points. So that's perhaps a dedicated person or department within different ministries that is responsible for implementing climate-related actions and liaising around climate response issues. Very importantly, all relevant organs of state must receive the necessary financial support, technological support, skills development, and capacity building to play their part. Climate response devolves on everyone ultimately, on all spheres of government, as well as the private sector and civil society. But from a government point of view, we need to see that all of these organs of state are sufficiently capacitated. Considerations should be mainstreamed in straight procurement policies, kind of setting the scene and the example. And of course, we need the effective monitoring and evaluation to make sure all of this happens properly. We need to have transparency and disclosure of information for a climate response. From our side, for example, we've repeatedly suggested that greenhouse gas emissions, carbon budgets, and compliance information be made publicly available, perhaps on an online portal, as happens in some countries. We need to know, are we on track to meeting our NDC commitments? Who are our biggest emitters? What facilities and sectors are emitted? And how's everybody doing? How's everyone measuring up in this all-important effort to adequately respond to the climate crisis? And finally, we need this climate change bill. It was nice to hear some updates and what the intention is. We need to act urgently. It's not the only tool that we need, but it's key and it's urgent, and we trust that Parliament can do all that it can to make sure the act comes into being as soon as possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Admiral. In the interest of time, I want to move directly on to presentation by Ms. Mandy Mazuris from Environmental Monitoring Group. And then I'd like to request my colleague, Mr. Manu Bufala, to take over the facilitation immediately after that of the discussion. Ms. Mazuris, you're going to talk to us about how Parliament can improve its contribution to better.
Hi everyone. I'm going to quickly share my screen. There it is. So, sorry, I'm missing the presentation. Great. Okay. So, hi everyone. I think just to start off with, for us and at EMG, society's relationship with nature and the natural environment is inextricably linked to our relationship with each other, making sustainable development impossible without environmental, economic, and social justice. This principle is key, particularly in the context of climate change. I've been listening to the other inputs in this discussion, and there's been a lot of focus on adaptation and the importance of addressing socioeconomic issues that hinder our resilience as a species to climate change. EMG completely agrees with this approach. However, what is being ignored are the drivers of this crisis. We are in this mess because of the pursuit for profit at the expense of both people and planet. If we do not fundamentally change the way we run our economies, the way we prioritize profit over humanity and the planet, very little will change. We saw in Crispin Oliver's presentation plans to shift mining from fossil fuel, but no plans to reduce mining, and no assessment on what the impact of mining in general is making on the planet. He spoke of handing back mined lands to communities. This is absurd. Land after mining is dead and it's contaminated and uninhabitable. If both nature and people are not at the center of plans, then what are we doing this for? And who are we doing this for? I've been asked to respond to the question, has Parliament done enough to respond to climate change? And honestly, the answer is no. To answer yes would mean that every policy and every law being written is being written and implemented with the deliberate intention of addressing both the mitigation of and resilience to climate change. In order to mainstream the issue, we have to see it as a socio-economic issue as much as it is an environmental issue. And the speakers before have spoken to this as well. But protecting the environment and reducing emissions alone is not enough to protect us from what is coming. We have to build a resilient society, and we have to build global solidarity, because this is a global challenge. We cannot do it alone as a country, and Parliament cannot do it with fancy policies that are never implemented. We need action, and we need action now. Situations where we wait 10 years for a national water resource strategy, for the National Water Resource Strategy 2, and when it comes, it arrives without an implementation plan, is shameful. In a climate crisis, such failures will be akin to a crime against humanity. Our very survival depends upon action, and action now. And Parliament has very sad track record in this regard. Every single portfolio has a role to play, as does every minister and department. All the policies have to align with a single vision. This vision cannot be one that is developed top-down and never implemented. It needs to be one that includes the voices of everybody, especially the marginalized in our society, and will never work if it does not balance human needs with the well-being of our natural environment. In the most unequal country in the world, disasters like the April floods in KwaZulu-Natal worsen inequality, have a disproportionately negative impact on the poor, exacerbate gender inequality, and worsen racial inequality. When we talk of resilience to climate change, we have to know that those with resources are more resilient than those without. Those with decent housing are less likely to become homeless. Those with water tanks or boreholes have access to water. Those with jobs, land, or money can afford expensive food, municipal or bottled water. Those with medical aid have access to better healthcare. Children in private schools have access to education online. The bottom line is that climate change impacts us all, but it does not impact us all equally. Government policies must not only be developed with climate change at the core, they absolutely must be followed up with efficient and timeous implementation. It cannot be business as usual. We have to listen to science when it tells us that large-scale industrial farming is bad for biodiversity and soil retention and less resilient to droughts, floods, and disease. Water is precious and must be protected at all costs. We have to fix our aging infrastructure and find ways to conserve this precious resource now, today. We need to understand that all fossil fuel driven energy is bad energy, that car power ships impact the livelihoods of fishers and reduce their resilience to climate change. We have to look for and implement solutions that protect the environment and the most vulnerable, first and foremost, not solutions that reinforce the status quo and keep the rich rich. EMG works with communities who are already preparing for climate change, specifically in the areas of agroecology and water. We work with communities and schools to understand their specific challenges and try to find ways to collectively overcome these. But people cannot do this on our own. It is essential that government listen to small-scale farmers in rural areas when they call for support to implement agroecological farming techniques, which we all know are more resilient to climate change. We also need to support access to markets, land, and water so they are economically resilient to droughts and floods. We have to ensure that we understand the impact of changes to policy around water, including tariffs or meters, and how this impacts the poor before we develop policies that ultimately end up denying their right to access water. Our response to climate change has to be grounded at a grassroots level, designed by the people, for people, and for the environment. Climate change can only be fought if everyone is able to fight. Our job is to mitigate emissions as much as possible and create a truly, truly equal society where everyone has what they need for the struggle to come. Thank you.
Tumani, over to you, sir.
Thank you, Program Director. I think I should take this time to thank everyone for being precise with their presentations and in exactly assisting us to answer the fundamental question on the role of Parliament insofar as climate change is concerned. I'm expected to deal with the issue of the poll. Unfortunately, our systems could not handle the poll, so we would like to apologize for that. We do not have the poll, but just to ease everyone's expectation, the questions were really related to issues around the role of Parliament, finance for climate emergency. So those were really the fundamental questions that we would like to get a sense of or to test within the audience. But be that as it may, I think we have reached that critical point in the baking industry. They call it placing the sugar, the icing on the cake. And it's very important. The cake is not complete without the icing on top. So it's that time of answer and questions. But I would like also to acknowledge that the questions that were raised, majority of them have been answered succinctly on the chat box. And for that, I think we should thank those panelists who have taken time to answer the questions. And some of the things that were put on the question and answer chart were really related to recommendations relating to the role of Parliament, and we are indeed indebted to all of you for those thoughtful and constructive recommendations on how to improve the systems within Parliament. I would like also to, without any further ado, there is two, I think, or three questions that I would like perhaps when Honorable Frolick, when he wraps up, maybe he can answer this because they relate directly to the management of systems within Parliament. One is relating to timeframes for the bill. When will it be processed? I know he has indicated early 2023, but I think he can add more there. And then another part to that question is whether Parliament will consider recommending processing of this bill urgently. That is one of the questions. And the one that I think it goes to Mr. Minele, it's around the breakdown of the 8.5 billion US dollars, whether that will be grants, soft and so on. So I think that detail was not there. So it will be grateful if we could get some answers to that. And the one from that, I think the agency relates to James Rila as well. So all in all, I think those were the questions that were posed, which I think a majority of them were answered, and the audience were privy to the answers. So I think with that, we were also hoping to have roundtable discussion where we would be hosting a chairperson of water and sanitation and respectively, and the human settlements. But unfortunately, they are not here today. And also we have run out of time. So I think it's appropriate that we should end here with answering questions. And I will hand back to Dr. Gabriel to perhaps, I think, release our audience. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Tumani, and thank you to everybody for staying the course with us. We still have 78 participants online. I don't want to keep us any longer, but just to give Honorable Frolick a final word, sir, and to thank the team from research and from your office for making this a success. Honorable Frolick.
No, thank you very much, Dr. Gabriel, and also thank you for the participants and panelists that were part of this webinar. It certainly is not the last engagement that we intend having. And I'm looking currently, I was sitting and, and jotting down here, Dr. Gabriel, maybe it will be interesting during the climate change conference itself, when members of parliament and other stakeholders are in Egypt. We must just sort out the logistics and connections. I'm quite sure there will be good connectivity, is that we have another webinar. But I'll discuss offline with you the logistics around that. Just to say, in terms of timeframes, the Veld and Forest Fire Amendment Bill is currently in front of the Committee on Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment, and they will conclude their deliberations on this bill very, very soon. Thereafter, on the 28th of October, which is essentially next week, they will start with the oral submissions. That is where the public, through public participation, will come to Parliament or on the hybrid platform to make their submissions. And the number of stakeholders who have made very, very good and concrete proposals today, I'm quite sure they are going to be part of those deliberations that will be taking place. In terms of the urgent processing of the bill, Parliament have certain rules, the National Assembly specifically, that it must observe in terms of processing of legislation. And one of the most important one is public participation. And that process cannot be rushed. We must ensure that we do get the input from the different stakeholders, whether it is through the public hearings or it is oral presentations in Parliament. And then the process must start to develop then the amendments, if any, to the bill. And that takes time. Legal services assist us with that process. So realistically speaking, going into the December recess, this bill will be processed and finalized by Parliament, or will be finalized by Parliament in the first quarter of next year, after which it will go to the National Council of Provinces. May I once again express my appreciation to the Minister of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment, as well as Dr. Crispin Olver, the Secretary to Parliament, of course, who graced us with his presence, and then also Mr. Minele, who's looking at the financial architecture and climate finance. All the other participants from civil society, we value your inputs, and also for clearly stating the importance for this process to be finalized. And then there was a question on the lifespan until 2023, until the elections of the Steering Committee on Climate Change. And I responded to that by saying the 7th Parliament, with a refreshed mandate from the electorate, are the ones who will decide on the mechanisms for oversight, keeping the executive accountable and the committees that they want to do so. So thank you very much for your participation. And once again, to the staff, led by Dr. Gabriel, for a job well done. We sincerely look forward to further engagement. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. And to everybody, a blessed evening. Thank you.
Recording stopped.